I'm grateful to be living in a time where indie games are doing such interesting things. I'm less happy about the planet being on fire, but I guess you can't have everything. I cannot see any of the big publishers really going in for a non-linear, narrative-driven sci-fi mystery game with a focus on linguistics and archaeology. So it's a good thing we have Inkle Studios, creators of 80 Days, to scratch that particular itch. Heaven's Vault, developed and published by the aforementioned in 2019, has you focusing on the young woman, Alia, and her robot companion, Six, as she travels the nebula, exploring ruins and translating ancient glyphs as she attempts to uncover and prevent a threat known only as the Great Darkness. Heaven's Vault has a unique look to go with its unique concept. The environments are 3D, but the characters are all 2D drawings which change in stop-motion fashion when moving or changing perspective. I thought this was really cool, particularly when I spun the camera all the way around and realised there were 11 different drawings depending on which way you were looking at her, and these work seamlessly when walking around. It feels like you're in control of a 3D character. Interestingly, also, is how well the 2D artwork and 3D environments blend together. Despite their obvious differences, I can't remember a single instance where they ever clashed or looked out of place. I've seen how well 3D character models can work with 2D environments when playing the top-down isometric RPGs, but I can't remember ever seeing the reverse. And it's done really well here. The game has a distinctly Middle Eastern inspiration, which most of the architecture and characters share, and uses a wealth of colour palettes to illustrate the differences between the various places you travel to, whether they be rich, poor, lush, dilapidated. You can't ever say the game is bland unless it's trying to be so. I do, however, wish there was a bit more variety between the unimportant NPCs. In populated areas, it does become jarring to see the same 5 or 6 clones aimlessly wandering around in close proximity to one another. The audio side of things is less impressive. I understand that for an indie studio, voice acting is expensive and a fully voiced game was simply never on the table, but for a game with so much dialogue, I thought there could have been a bit more. Maybe some essential lines, or even just for greetings and goodbyes. The only voice acting the game does have is of Alia giving some introductory exposition when arriving at a new place.
A single rocky peak was topped by a gleaming ruin.
Additionally, there isn't much in the way of music either. About half the time you'll just be listening to ambient noise. When you are listening to music, it's not very memorable, certainly not very varied, and just generally seems to be quite ominous, which isn't necessarily a poor choice for exploring ancient abandoned ruins, except that that's rarely the tone set by the dialogue. Alia and Six happily banter their way through most of these places. There are some impressive string compositions in its soundtrack, but they are mostly short and uncommon. The combination of no voice acting with minimal or ominous music gives many of the conversations an eerie quality even when there's nothing creepy about the subject matter. Obviously, this is something you become more accustomed to as you play, but even towards the end of my second playthrough, the sinister tension underscoring quite normal conversations never stopped sticking out to me. This is very much a narrative-driven game. If you aren't interested in world building, characters, plot, and dialogue, then I don't think it's for you. The gameplay is split into 4 areas: sailing, exploration, translating, and most of all, talking. They're all interwoven with one another, so it's difficult to know which to start with, but I think I'll go with talking. It's a well-written game, and there is a lot of dialogue. Huge amounts. Gabbing and gossiping, conversing and conferring. You, as Alia, must spend at least 85% of the game talking with someone, mostly with her companion Six, but also with certain NPCs whom you will return to multiple times. There are 2 types of conversation. Close-ups, where the conversation is the focus, and optional dialogue, which you have while exploring or sailing. In the former, you usually have a choice of 3 things to say. The options you choose do affect the responses you receive, rather than all of them being different wordings of the same question. I felt I was gathering information better in my second playthrough because I was more careful about choosing what I said depending on what I was trying to learn about. You can also choose not to let someone know something if you have reasons to be distrustful of them. These close-ups are for the important information and decisions. The latter is less involved. You will be prompted to press Q or R for question or remark. These prompts will keep appearing until all dialogue on that subject has been exhausted, so it's entirely up to you how much of it you want to hear, if you want to hear any of it at all. Though if you're not interested, then, again, probably not the game for you. It's not clear whether these options are that distinct from one another. I believe I saw examples that did differ between my two playthroughs, as opposed to them just being the same choice either with or without a question mark at the end. The irritating thing is that there is no way of knowing what you're going to say, only that it will either be in the form of a statement or a question, which doesn't much engage you with whatever is being said. You might as well just have one prompt for all the difference it makes to the player. Hey guys, this is video editing Mythic, just interrupting voiceover Mythic real quick to say that now that I'm looking over the clips, I cannot actually find very many instances of a time when you get to choose between question and remark, which is kind of messing me up a bit because I've played through this game twice now and I could have sworn you almost always had the choice, but quite often you only actually get given the choice question or remark, so you only get one button prompt anyway. So yeah, it's a bit puzzling as to why they didn't just list the dialogue, like in the close-ups, though one explanation is that it could be a bit of smoke and mirrors to hide that the options aren't as different from one another as I thought. The game understands that dialogue is probably its most important feature, and so makes sure that nothing gets in the way of that. If you arrive at your destination while sailing mid-conversation, it will give you the time to finish before loading the new location. Similarly, when exploring, there are some invisible boundaries that you cross to enter a new area. You quickly learn where these are, but initially it can be a little jarring when you're walking around and suddenly you're forced into a close-up, but this is just the game's way of making sure that your conversation isn't unceremoniously cut off. There is a fluidity to all this dialogue, the result of a conscious decision, one assumes, to have the conversations flow naturally. It reminds me of Oxenfree in some ways, and it works. However, I did see one review complaining how it was impossible for him to follow with his dyslexia, and I sympathise with him there. There is no chat history, and the words are only ever on the screen for a few seconds at a time. Even if you don't suffer from any conditions that affect your ability to read, it can be very easy to miss some if you're focusing on something else, or even if you just spaced out for a moment. One way of solving this would obviously be to have an option to allow you to choose when to receive the next line. I don't think this would have been a good solution though. I do think something aesthetically would be lost if the words hung around on the screen, frozen in time until permitted to disappear. But would the game have lost anything with the inclusion of a chat log? It has a timeline for important discoveries after all. For this, realism could be a factor. An archaeologist would make a note of all their discoveries, but obviously wouldn't record every word of every conversation they ever have. But frankly, there's enough game logic in Heaven's Vault that I can't imagine a chat log would seem out of place. In the nebula, there are plenty of moons to explore. You reach these moons by sailing the rivers. Sailing isn't especially interesting. You can't go off the edge or crash into rocks, which is a good thing because the game is not designed to be a racer. It is, however, somewhat dull as it's rather slow paced and doesn't require much interaction from you, though this is probably so that you can focus on the dialogue, and in any case, if you're returning to somewhere you've already been, you can skip the journey. But I was always hesitant to do this, at least in my first playthrough, because I was worried what I might miss conversation-wise. In New Game Plus, you will retain your knowledge of the rivers, and thus can fast travel pretty much everywhere. To sail somewhere, you choose a destination, and the game plots a route out for you. Most of the time, you just follow the game's directions, either via on-screen arrows or Six's verbal instructions, though you do have to be a little careful because both of these can sometimes be wrong. If you haven't found enough clues to pinpoint the exact location of a new moon, but know the general area, then you will be directed to it and from there must explore possible locations until you find it. These are probably the most tedious parts of the game, because the rivers in these areas are very slow, so it's more like you're floating rather than sailing, but these sections do take up comparatively little of the game. Although it might sound like it, this is not an open world game. There are only 2 moons which you can almost always freely travel to. The rest you cannot return to unless Alia has a specific reason. This is another example of Heaven's Vault's game logic, but we'll talk about why after I've covered exploration. Once you've sailed somewhere, you go exploring. You do this by walking around and clicking on little orbs that appear to denote points of interest, usually items, translations, or conversation prompts, sometimes all three. Items serve a few purposes. Some are inscribed with glyphs to be translated, some are just tools worth hanging onto in case you need to break something open at a later date. Some, this is one example of the aforementioned game logic, help you to pinpoint the location of a new moon you are trying to find. Everything, I believe, can be donated to a scholar called Huang, and some can be traded with a thief called Tappy. In return, you will receive information or more things to translate. You don't really need to stress about what you should trade and what you should keep. In my first playthrough, I barely traded anything, and it was the opposite in my second, and there were no colossal differences as a result. Why? I'm glad you asked, because this seems the perfect opportunity to talk about Heaven's Vault's dedication to non-linearity. The reason, I believe, and this is theory on my part, but I'm fairly confident about it, that Heaven's Vault generally doesn't allow you to return to somewhere you have been before is so that you will never get stuck. You can progress through the game two completely different ways, and you never will get stuck. It has no interest in holding you up point and click style while you try to solve that one puzzle or look for that one item you need. By not allowing you to return to places you've been, it stops you from scouring places you've already explored in the hopes of finding a new clue, and will introduce the information you need, usually to help find the area of a new location, by other means, maybe conversation, or trade, or finding an item in small ruins you can stop at while sailing. Because of this, it doesn't matter where and when you choose to go to places, and it doesn't matter if you don't find everything before you leave. In fact, 6 will sometimes recommend you leave before you've explored the whole area. Again, this is theory, but I played through the game twice and tried to do as much differently as possible the second time, and I never once hit a wall. That's pretty impressive, even if it is a bit smoke and mirrors. It is non-linearity within strict confines. I went about it in a different order on my second playthrough, but I still visited and explored all the same places. But until we have hyper-intelligent AI constructing whole games for us akin to a dungeon master, we won't have truly non-linear games. The fourth and final area of gameplay is its most notable. On walls, or pottery, or in books, everywhere, you will find strange-looking glyphs, snippets of the ancient language. Translation involves guessing which words match which collection of symbols. Initially, these symbols are split up for you and you're given 4 possible options as to what each selection could be. The game remembers which words you've assigned to which group of glyphs, and over time, when those glyphs reappear and the phrase you're using them in makes sense, Aaliyah will confirm your choice is correct, or if it doesn't, she'll rule it out. Sometimes she determines this even when she doesn't know what any of the other symbols in the sentence mean, which is my final example of game logic. A bit like how the insurance suspector aboard the Obra Dinn confirms the identities of the ship's crew 3 at a time. Once you have a few words guessed, you will have to start splitting up the symbols yourself by inserting the words you either know or have guessed into the phrase, and then guessing at what's left. I'm no linguist by any stretch of the imagination, so I figured out very little about the rules of the language until I had stopped playing and looked them up. But I won't spoil that. It's easy to find a guide if you're interested. No, I figured out most of the translations through guesswork, which is generally a feasible way of doing it as long as your sentence makes sense and you pay some attention to the context. Ultimately, as I said before, you only get 4 options, so if Aaliyah rules one of your guesses is incorrect, then you can usually get it the second time. The fact that they have, at least in the written sense, seemingly created an entire language is incredibly impressive. If you start the game again on New Game Plus, you retain everything you've managed to learn about the language, and so the translations will actually become more complex if you go round again to keep it interesting. There's a part in the game where you can, if you want, sit and translate your way through a big book you find. And it's a big book. During both of my playthroughs, it took me about an hour, and in the second playthrough, I still had about a third of the book that I either had to guess at or just straight did not know enough to read. The sheer volume included is truly commendable. Interestingly though, despite being the game's standout feature, it has very little impact on the game. As far as I can tell, you can go through the game getting every translation wrong and it wouldn't impede your progress in any way. It's exclusively a world-building feature, which means you'll struggle to understand the story and the history, but you'll still be able to move forward. However, and I probably don't need to repeat this again, but if you aren't interested in that, the rest of the game won't hold your interest. It may not be mechanically essential, but to the sort of players who will enjoy Heaven's Vault, it's just as important. It's difficult to know exactly how much of Heaven's Vault's story to cover. The entire game contributes, and I'm obviously not going over all of it, but without the context provided by the rest of the game, highlighting specific areas seems a bit pointless. As a result, I'm going to avoid spoilers and just talk about it generally. If you enjoy the notion of being an archaeologist, of uncovering things no one has seen for centuries and puzzling out what they were used for and what happened to them, of following leads and solving mysteries, you are the target audience. The history of the nebula stretches back thousands of years and has gone through several labelled historical periods. Alia's search to understand and prevent the Great Darkness actually has a fairly simple conclusion, but there's a lot of history to wade through until then. Much of it isn't directly relevant to the answers she's seeking, but it may lead her to the next clue. It's engaging for sure, and because it's happy to let you miss things, you might, like me, decide to dive back in after you finish, so you can try to figure out the things you never understood. I did have to push myself a bit to finish my second playthrough, because it gets somewhat tedious re-exploring places you've already been to, especially when you don't have the driving force of wanting to know what's going on. But different conversations and more complex translations alleviate this. I thought it a game best played at a pace. I didn't usually play it for very long at one time. If I caught myself zoning out of the dialogue, that was a good sign to take a break, but was also always keen to come back to it and find out what happened next. As I said at the beginning, I'm glad we have indie studios working on games like these. They may not always be perfect, but gaming is more interesting for them. Thanks, and see you next time.